Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Another great episode in our Ukraine series. We have Dr. Robert Farley of the University of Kentucky here to speak about air power. There have been so many questions in this conflict about no-fly zones, giving MiGs to Ukraine, debates around why the Russians still haven't taken air superiority in the country yet, the role of drones, so many broad topics involved with questions of air that have really not been able to be answered up until now, especially on this show. So I thought bringing an air power expert on to discuss all aspects of air power here, but also moving forward away from Ukraine would be a perfect episode for us. Hope you enjoy it. Dr. Robert Farley, welcome to the Realignment.
Wow, thanks. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to speak with you. So we are going to focus on the broader conversation around air power in Ukraine and beyond. We're also going to hit a topic of great interest to you, which is the battleship. We've been focusing on the Navy to a degree, which hasn't been true for most listeners over the past 20 years. So we'll have to get into that towards the end. Let's just start here. Would love to get a just introduction to your interest in air power and the work you've been doing on that topic for a while.
So air power is one of the national security topics that I've been interested in for a while. When people ask me how did I get interested in battleships and airplanes, I point out that every 7-year-old boy is interested in them, and I just never lost my enthusiasm for them. And that tracked through my undergraduate and into my graduate experience. I went to the University of Washington, studied international security as part of my doctoral program. And then when I got out, I wanted to write more about air power, sea power, military technology, the diffusion of military technology. And so that's kind of where I've been.
Yeah, and I'd love you just to talk about, as you've written about air power for the past, decade plus, a lot of listeners and consumers of news have not really been focused on that topic. It's the war in Iraq, it's the war in Afghanistan. Obviously, there's a air power element to that, especially in the counterinsurgency piece when it comes to Afghanistan. But the type of air power that people are seeing deployed to Ukraine, the debates, no-fly zone, sending MiGs, that's entirely separate. So can you basically, how should people consider air power during this transition?
So, that's a really large question, and I guess it kind of has 3 or 4 different ways of getting at it. The first thing I'd say is that generally speaking, Americans, but I think people across most of the Western world, just don't have the level of detailed understanding of military affairs that they would have had in the 1980s or the 1970s or something along those lines. And in part because that's because the conscription ended. There are fewer people with military experience. Since 1990, a lot of the stuff has just been sort of less interesting and less cool. And so I think that the reason that we're seeing such wildly divergent polling on things like no-fly zones, where people ask, should we have a no-fly zone? Yeah. Well, that means shooting down Russian airplanes. No, is just reflective of the fact that there's not a lot of real knowledge and education about these issues out there. We are coming out of a period in which the United States was the dominant aerospace power. That appears to be ending, in large part, not necessarily because of increases in Russian power, but because of increases in Chinese power. What that means for things like no-fly zones is that the United States cannot count on uncontested airspace in the future like it has in the past. What we're seeing in this current conflict is that even a large and generally well-regarded air force like the Russian Air Force is really nervous around surface air missile systems, the kind of surface air missile systems that we would see in almost any conflict that we'd be looking forward to in the future. And what we're also sort of, I think, coming up against and understanding is that the way that air combat is fought today is dramatically different than it was fought in Vietnam, dramatically different than it was fought even in the Gulf War in 1991, a lot different than the popular cultural works that are still extant, like Top Gun and so forth. I mean, fighter jets don't play like that anymore. That's not how the war is fought. The F-35 is a completely different machine than the F-16. It does entirely different things in ways that are to understand why it's good at the things it's good at, you have to understand, you have to have a lot of detailed knowledge about what people want to do with it. And so this war is interesting in that, we are kind of seeing what modern air combat looks like between two fairly sophisticated opponents.
Help me understand that part, because to your point, this isn't Top Gun. You aren't seeing F-14s versus reconfigured F-5s, which is what the stand-in for the unnamed power of it Tom Cruise is fighting against was going against. But a lot of the planes that we're seeing, the MiG-29s, the Su-25s, 27s, these are actually from that same Top Gun era. So how have the action, and obviously we realize that the technology within them is different. These are not the same chassis, but not literally the same. How has this changed given what I was just setting up?
Yeah, so the biggest things that have changed is almost all of these legacy platforms, and the United States has them too, right? The United States still flies F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, right? These are all Cold War aircraft. The biggest differences are that the extent and accuracy of sensors has increased a lot, and this is sensors and radars that are in the aircraft itself, but also the ability of any given aircraft to take advantage of lots of other sensors that are in the air, on the ground, and so forth, to paint a full picture of what the battle space looks like. And the extension in range of air-to-air munitions on both the Russian side and on the American side and on the Chinese side, and on the Europeans too, right? And this was, even in the 1980s, the F-14 would, generally speaking, never engage a target in visual range, right? But the F-14 was kind of special in that way. But now most sophisticated modern aircraft basically think about how they're going to kill somebody from something we call BVR, which is beyond visual range. And so the expectation is that you're going to go up there, you're going to shoot your missile, and your missile is either going to kill or not kill your opponent, but you're never going to see them because you're going to turn around as soon as you shoot your missile and fly as fast as you can. And that kind of produces some misunderstandings with respect to what a no-fly zone is supposed to look like. Because advocates of a no-fly zone, I think, have been unclear about the fact that Russian aircraft can fly all the way up to the Russian border, can fire air-to-air missiles from the Russian side of the border, and those air-to-air missiles can kill NATO or Ukrainian aircraft in Ukraine 100 miles inside the border. And so if you really want to have an NFC, that means you have to shoot down Russian planes in Russia. And that becomes a really complicated thing when you think about how modern air combat actually looks.
That's a good way of thinking about this, because usually when I'd heard the no-fly zone critique, I thought of it from the sense of, well, to have a no-fly zone, you'd have to shut down Russian air defense within the Russian border. But your point is, even within the air, much of the strategic objective you'd be aiming for could actually be achieved within the Russian border then.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the big letter about humanitarian corridors, let's have a no-fly zone for humanitarian corridors. What does that mean, right? I mean, all I can imagine is it means that Russian aircraft are not allowed to fly over these corridors. But hey, what we've found out is that Russian bombers are firing cruise missiles from, and sometimes ballistic missiles, from hundreds of miles inside Russia. Right, and they're carrying out these strikes without ever leaving Russian airspace. And so the things that are hitting the humanitarian corridor, it's not like a fighter bomber dropping bombs right above your convoy of refugees. It's a missile that's been fired by a plane that's already 250 miles away when the missile strikes. And so in that context, a no-fly zone over a humanitarian corridor just doesn't even begin to make sense to me. Right? I mean, you have to be protecting the humanitarian corridor, but protecting that means you're killing people hundreds of miles away.
So within this critique, it's not merely just that there would be a risk of escalation from the no-fly zone. It's actually just unclear, given the actual style of warfare that's being undergone right now, that it would actually accomplish the objective you would have, which is providing security.
Yeah, I mean, you got to be envisioning. So these, again, a lot of these Russian missiles, they were fired in Syria. They're being fired now, long-range precision munitions. F-22s or whatever else you wanted to kill things with would have to fly, often well into Russian airspace to hunt the bombers that are launching these missiles. So the idea that you can confine your no-fly zone to some particular corridor, that doesn't prevent people from shooting weapons into that corridor. And so that makes it just a really incredibly difficult operational task.
It seems like implicit point you're making is that for much of the American public, aside from just the popular conceptions of Top Gun, I would just see that it seems that our perception of air warfare, whether it's strategic bombing or otherwise, is really caught in World War II and then the Vietnam War period. So we've talked about how this is different than the 1980s Top Gun Hollywood version. How has air war changed since the World War II to Vietnam period?
Yeah, I mean, so the biggest thing in terms of, the ability of airplanes to deliver munitions to the ground, the biggest two changes are that you can do it from a lot farther away than you could in Vietnam. So you don't have to fly an A4 or an A6 over the target in order to attack it. For some munitions you do, for really heavy like ground GBUs and bunker busters and so forth, you have to actually drop it on the target. But most munitions you fire from pretty far away. And there's usually some kind of guidance, radar, laser, ground guidance, that's going to make that munition pretty precise. Now, whether it's precise enough to hit a moving target is a different question, and the Russians aren't very good at that, but the Americans certainly are, and the Russians can hit stationary targets, right? So they can blow up these Ukrainian factories that are in Western Ukraine without ever flying a plane into Ukrainian airspace, right? Because they can pinpoint where it is through various reconnaissance, and the factory doesn't move, and then you just blow it up from a long way away, and that's what their heavy bombers do. That's even what their fighter bombers do.
So the next question would be, we've talked about the no-fly zone. There's also obviously the MiG-29 controversy, which we've moved past because it was shut down. But I'd love you just to talk about, let's pretend the decision hadn't been shut down there. What would let's forget the escalatory parts purely. What would have been the impact of introducing old MiG-29s? I know it's hard to make a prediction here, but what was the expected value add that they were going to provide?
So Ukrainian Air Force is still flying. In fact, there was a great New York Times article that came out just this morning that talked a lot about the sorties they're still flying. So most of the Ukrainian Air Force is still intact. They're just really careful, right? So they're not flying at full capacity. You're seeing less than the total number of aircraft that they can put in the air. They're really careful about Russian surface-to-air missile systems. It doesn't look like we've had that much in the way of air-to-air combat so far. I think there's been some, but mostly Russian and Ukrainian aircraft have been basically staying away from one another. Adding 23 Polish MiG-29s, I think in the abstract absolutely increases Ukrainian military capability, right? Because they have more platforms in more places that they can launch, which makes the Russians more nervous about deploying their own aircraft into the airspace. Whether the Ukrainians are willing to chase the Russians at Russia would be a different question, and probably not, given Russian air defenses. So I think that there really would be some military power aggregation from donating these MiG-29s. But what people have to appreciate is that these MiG-29s that Poland has have been through a whole series of upgrades since 1991, when Poland left the Warsaw Pact. And that has involved all kinds of NATO stuff. It's involved new electronics. It's involved new weapons control and new kinds of weapons. And that kind of stuff has an impact on the structure of the cockpit, right? So the cockpit of a Polish MiG looks different now than it would have in the 1990s. And Ukrainian MiGs have gone under the same process, right? So Ukraine was a big manufacturer of MiGs during the Cold War. And in fact, one of the factories that the Russians just blew up was a MiG factory. And so their MiGs have also undergone a series of upgrades since 1990. And so it's not like we're looking at the difference between a 97 Corolla and an 02 Camry in terms of what, basically the inside looks like. You have entirely different weapons procedures, entirely different weapons capabilities, much different electronic systems. Now, could a gruff, tough Ukrainian pilot jump in that airplane and go and do something with it? It's very possible. But that's not how the United States trains its pilots when there are changes in the equipment, right? I mean, we take weeks and months to train on new equipment, especially when there's such a divergence between what Polish MiGs look like now and what Ukrainian MiGs look like now. You'd be really nervous from an American point of view about putting a pilot who's only flown the one in the other and expecting him or her to be combat capable.
So here's the question. I'd love for you to explain the idea behind different generations of fighters. So for example, we're talking about fourth generation fighters, the reference you made to the F-22, the F-35, the modern fighters people will think of these are obviously fifth generation fighters. This war has been all about the fourth generation fighters. Obviously, Ukraine only has fourth generation ones, but Russia hasn't introduced its fifth generation fighters. So can you explain the idea behind these generations and why this warfare has been constrained to the fourth?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll go into a little bit of history. So the first generation is like World War II and the fighters that were available at the end of World War II. So like,
and we mean jet fighters, correct? That's
jet
what
fighters,
we're,
yeah. Me-262, the P-80, and so forth. Your second generation, you're starting to get to your F-86 Sabre, which is in Korea, but then also to like an F-100 Super Sabre. By generation 3, you're largely looking at the first generation of like really capable supersonic fighters. So this would be a MiG-21 or a MiG-23 on the Soviet side. On the American side, it would be an F-4 Phantom, right, or an F-105 or something along those lines. And we still actually do find Generation 3 fighters out there. There are lots of MiG-21s still about that are in service. I mean, it's a pretty basic airplane that works pretty well. It goes pretty fast. It can drop stuff. Doesn't have sort of a lot of the doohickeys that Generation 4 fighters do, but it can be an effective platform for certain kinds of things. Generation 4 is kind of when we sorted out, like the United States and France and Russia all kind of sorted out at the same time. This is how you optimize an airframe, right? So we take everything we learned with the F4 and say, okay, now that we know this, what can we do? Well, we can make an F-15 and we can make an F-16 and we can make an F-18, right? And they all have slightly different roles, but they're about as optimal as you can get. And on the Russian side, we have the MiG-29 and we have the Su-27, right? And these are, fabulous fighter planes. On the European side, we have the Eurofighter. And the basic platform, the basic frame of the aircraft, there's just not a lot you can improve on, right? You've sort of reached the end of the technological frontier on a whole bunch of different areas with the Generation 4 fighter. Now, you can then do other stuff to it. You can make it a little bit more stealthy. You can improve its electronics. You can improve its weapon systems, and you can bump it up to something we call a Generation 4.5, which is something like the F-15EX would be along those lines, the newest Eurofighters. Generation 5 is something altogether different, right? Generation 5, you've made the decision that you want to go stealthy. There are a couple other requirements. You have to have networked communications. You have to have super cruise, so you can cruise for extended periods supersonically. And there are only a few Generation 5 fighters out there. The F-22 is the oldest and most operational, the F-35 on the American side, the Chinese J-20, so they're the Flying Dragon or the Super Dragon or the Amazing, some kind of dragon. And then the Su-57 on the Russian side, which is called the Felon under NATO, which is absolutely fabulous, right? That's just a wonderful name for a fighter, is the Felon. And that's the Russian one. But the Russians have been really slow to produce and to put into service the Felon. They threw it into Syria basically for demonstration flights. I don't believe that any Felons have operated anywhere near Ukraine during this conflict. And I think that's because the platform is still really, really immature. And so basically what we're having right now is, Russian Generation 4 and 4.5 fighters, which are like upgraded Su-27s, against Ukrainian Generation 4 fighters, which are MiG-29s and somewhat less upgraded Su-27s.
It seems if you look at the numbers of these Generation 5 fighters, so from the Su-57 to the F-20, there actually aren't that many of them produced relative to the numbers of fighters we were producing during generations, 1 through 4. What's the reason for that? And this is across the board, Russian, American, Chinese. Like, what's explaining the gap?
So they're just much harder to build, right? And this has been a lot of the Russian problem. I mean, older Russian fighters, they're designed to be flown by, pilots who just really aren't that well trained and maintained by crews that aren't really that well trained. But, you can hit them with a baseball bat and they'll continue to function, right? Because if a rivet's out of place, right, no big deal, right? Stealth fighter's not that way. So a stealth fighter requires very specialized coating. It requires machine tooling that is primed to, absolute, microscopic tolerances. Because if anything is out of place, then the stealth fighter has a radar signature. It stops being a stealth fighter. The coatings are hard to maintain. They're hard to produce. The flight hours for the aircraft are more expensive than for your Generation 4 fighters. And the other thing is that, none of Russia, China, or the United States until, basically right now, thought that you were going to have a war of the size where you would require the hundreds, possibly thousands of fighters that it was anticipated you would need during the Cold War, right? I mean, the Russians anticipated losing thousands of fighters on the first day of a NATO-Warsaw Pact conflict. And we also envisaged, gigantic attrition. Since no country has to plan, or at least before 4 weeks ago, no country had to plan around the idea of like massive mechanized ground combat supported by an air force. You just didn't need to build that many. Now, that's really where the F-35 is set apart, right? Because people talk all the time, well, the F-35 is the most expensive military project in the history of humankind, right? Which is true, but it is also producing an aircraft in the numbers, a Generation 5 aircraft, in the numbers that countries used to produce Generation 4 and Generation 3 aircraft. And that has enabled the unit price on the F-35 to go pretty low. And so that's sort of the F-35's asymmetric advantage.
Yeah, I saw this on Wikipedia. So you have, the F-22 production has ceased. We've got hundreds of F-22s versus projected thousands of F-35s. Another thing I really identified with your 7-year-old interest in battleships and planes. It's why I had this like big book. So I remember a lot of the names and the fighters here. And something 7-year-olds will notice is back 40s, 50s, 60s, even to the 80s, there were so many different fighters. You have the F-111, you have the entire Century series. So 104s, 105s, 106s, all these different numbers, yet over time, and you see this on the Russian side too, you're throwing on the 27s and the, then there's the SUs and the MiG-31. Now there's the MiG-29, all these different numbers. But now we're talking about the F-35. We're talking about the F-22 and like Generation 4.5 fighters like Super Hornet or, the Strike Eagle. Why is the amount of airframes countries put up in general, why has it constrained inwards?
So, I mean, I think there are a few reasons. One is just a cost management decision by air forces. When you have something like the Century series, so we go into the Vietnam War with the 6 different Century series aircraft, plus the F-4, plus the F-111, blah, 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 blah. That means that your maintenance costs go up because you have to train maintainers for every different type, and they're often very, very different. Your equipment and spare parts also go up, right? Because instead of supporting a fleet of 800 F-35As, that's a much easier thing to do than supporting a fleet of 12 different types of aircraft. And the Russians have kind of done pretty much the same thing, right? They've narrowed down to a few types that they're focusing on in order to reduce overall costs. I mean, the other difference is that even before stealth, the cost of a fighter program in terms of doing all of the research and all of the technology development went straight through the roof, was going straight through the roof even before basically we invented stealth. And so whereas in the 1950s, we had 10 different companies that were able to come up with 10 different kinds of fighters. And if you look from 1945 to 1955, the space between first flight and obsolescence is like 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have, because the technology is changing so rapidly that you have to build new stuff. Well, technology is in a lot of ways changing more slowly. And so trying to get technological advantage costs that much more. And so even for a company, it's that much more expensive to develop a single kind of fighter. Well, if I could say one more thing about this,
Please.
The Air Force knows this, right? And one of the most interesting things to come out of American air power and thinking about the American Defense Industrial Base has been something that Dr. Will Roper has termed the Next Century Series, or the Next Generation Air Dominance Project. And this project sort of says, well, look, we can borrow industrial techniques from the automobile industry, where, the automobile industry, your 2018 Corolla is different than your 2019 Corolla, is different than your 2020 Corolla. Why can't we make a fighter jet that's different than last year's, but slightly better, and the next one's different than last year's, but slightly better? If we borrow some of the techniques that they use, and there are answers in the past why that wouldn't work, but now you have computer drafting techniques, you have a lot of technologies that 3D printing, other kinds of manufacturing technologies, that you might be able to have a future in which you basically have, oh, hey, the new 2023 or 2033 Lockheed Martin with its improvement over the 2022 model, right? Something along those lines. But we're still in the speculative phase on that.
I want to get to that really excellent New York Times article that you referenced. We'll put this in the show notes for folks, but could you go up? Well, here's the question that comes to mind from that piece immediately. Why hasn't Russia achieved air superiority, given the nature of the fight they have?
No, that's a really good question. And it's fascinating because every war game and every expectation that almost anybody ran before assumed that the Russians would have air dominance, not just air superiority, but air supremacy. And those are two distinct terms, right? Air superiority means you have an advantage in the air. Air supremacy means you control the air. And at this point, it's not even obvious that the Russians can consistently claim air superiority. We anticipated that the Russians would do this like the Americans would do it, right? So we would identify every single surface-to-air missile system in the country, and certainly every large and mobile one. We would attack it with what we call SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense, through drones, through manned aircraft, through standoff ranges. We would concentrate attacks on Ukrainian airfields, right, on any visible Ukrainian aircraft. We would hunt every Ukrainian aircraft that we could find, and that would be priority number one from literally the first minutes of the conflict. It would be the first thing that we would do. And that's because we expect to have air supremacy, and we expect to be able to do it, and we expect to meet effective enemy surface-to-air missile systems, and we have to destroy them. And we've practiced doing that since the 1960s, really. The Russians haven't, right? For the Russians, their entire doctrine of how they use air power is different, right? I mean, they expected a completely different environment during the Cold War, if the war went hot, where they would lose lots of aircraft on the first day, some of them to SAMs, some of them to enemy aircraft, but then they would overrun the bases. They would attack bases maybe with ballistic missiles, but basically the ground forces would they would have to endure enemy air superiority for a bit, and then they wouldn't. And Russian activity since then has largely been, based around this. Like you expect there'll be enemy SAMs, but you figure out how to deal with that until the ground forces get there. The Syrian rebels didn't have very much in the way of surface-to-air missiles. The Georgians did, and they shot down several aircraft. That was really embarrassing for the Russians. And so the Russians really lack this giant surface, or this suppression of enemy air defense capability that the United States and other Western countries have, labored to build over the past 30 years, and they use so effectively in Libya and in Iraq and in Iraq again, or Serbia, right, where we have built into our capabilities that we will clear not only the skies, but we'll also clear the ground of stuff that can kill our airplanes. And the Russians don't have that. They just don't have that. And so they can't fly lots of airplanes into Ukrainian airspace because they're worried about losing those airplanes, and they're expensive.
And this is interesting because, as you just pointed out, then so much of Russian strategic thinking in the air sense is rooted in the Cold War. And this is pure conventional wisdom in the space, but so much of post Cold War military thinking has been rooted in Desert Storm in Iraq in 1991. So why wouldn't the Russians say, hey, we are the United States in this case? Ukraine is Iraq in the sense that they have a modern military. Iraq had, one of the biggest tank armies in the world. They have a modern military, but end of the day, we can do these very specific things to finish this up quickly. The Russians wanted to get Kyiv by, 3 or 4 days in. So I just don't understand why they would maintain that Cold War mentality in the face of this.
Well, so it's a huge investment, right? So the United States began sort of taking note of problems of how to deal with enemy SAMs in the 1960s when we were having our planes shot down over Vietnam, right? So that creates this community within the Air Force and the Navy. It's called the Wild Weasels, where basically it's like we identify enemy surface or enemy SAM networks and we destroy them. There's a great book by a fighter pilot named Dan Hampton. It's called Viper Pilot. He flew F-16s in the Wild Weasel role. And he's a fighter pilot, so he boasts a lot. But basically, he makes the argument that this is the most elite profession among fighter pilots, is hunting down enemy missile networks. Again, up until 1991, this just wasn't a priority for the Russians because they didn't think that it was going to be a big deal for having to do it. And then after 1991, you have the complete decapitalization of Russian military capabilities. So they're not flying very much. They can't really they don't have the money to research or to buy new kinds of weapon systems. The pilots don't fly enough hours to really develop an expertise on how to fight against enemy SAM systems. And so they never really have the opportunity to build up this capability. Now, I think that for Russia's next war, probably suppression of enemy air defense is going to be a big deal. But for this one, it's hot, especially with the degree to which the United States and NATO are flooding Ukraine with new surface-to-air missile systems. It's hard to see the Russian Air forces really having a decisive effect or learning how to deal with those in this particular conflict.
So can you talk about the surface-to-air missile aspect here? So what are the Russians facing from the ground? You made the point that there's a difference between stationary and mobile targets. So what does the picture look like if you're looking at Ukraine, if you're Russian right now?
Right, so I wish I had a better handle of the equipment, but I'll give the general classes. So, generally speaking, you're going to have big systems like, say, an S-300 or an S-300 and S-400 that is going to cover a huge amount of airspace. I think for the S-400, which is the best of the best, it's better than American equipment. You can track dozens of targets at 400 up to 400 miles away. S-300 is kind of like that, only less, but you can shoot down stuff that's a really long ways away, which I'm going to go back and hobby horse this, is another reason why a no-fly zone is a problem, because a Russian surface-to-air missile system can be in Russia 100 miles inside the border, and it can still kill an American fighter. What do you do about that in the context of an NFC? And then you have medium-range systems that are more like the Buck, which is the one that shot down the Malaysian jetliner back in 2014. And these are lethal systems that'll basically cover areas, and they'll be able to shoot down planes operating at a fairly substantial altitudes, more than just helicopters that are attacking your stuff. And this is what's really flooding the Ukraine right now, is manpads and other small mobile SAMs. And these are, based on individuals, and these are great for killing really low flying fixed wing aircraft. And sometimes those fixed wing aircraft have to fly low because they feel a threat from the medium range or the long range systems. And so they fly into the teeth of the portable systems, but are also really effective against helicopters. And so that's the kind of increasingly spiky and bristly Ukrainian air defense that we're seeing. And it's not obvious at this point that the Russians have done very much even to degrade what the Ukrainians had on day one, as opposed to what they have now. But this is also, why the Ukrainians themselves are flying fairly limited sorties, because the Russians they have their big long range systems in Russia, but they're also moving mobile systems into Ukraine. And so Ukrainian pilots are justly more afraid of the Russian surface-to-air missile systems than they are of the Russian fighters.
Yeah, and to that point, as I understand it, one of Ukraine's top fighter pilots was actually killed very early in the war by, this was the longest ever recorded kill by, I think it's by the S-400 in terms of, I'm not even sure it's from within the country. So that goes to that point. So let's talk about what can and what is the Ukrainian Air Force doing. So for example, the New York Times article cites 10 sorties a day on a good day from the Ukrainians. There was this big discourse for a while, a few weeks ago, around there's this 40-mile convoy, and attacking a convoy in an air-to-ground role is different than air-to-air combat in the missile sense. So, are the Ukrainians mostly focused on air-to-air fighting? Are they focused on the air-to-ground role? And we need to get into the drones, especially the Bayraktar, in a second. But what is the Ukrainian MiG-29 or Su-27 doing right now?
So to my understanding, and I don't know what we have yet in terms of a breakdown between air-to-air kills versus surface-to-air kills, but to my understanding, most of the Ukrainian missions right now are air-to-ground. Right, they are attacking, visible concentrations of Russians, especially visible concentrations of Russians where there doesn't appear to be any surface-to-air missile systems. I think that they are also flying just to be a fleet in being, right, so that the Russians are fully aware of their presence and know that it's dangerous to fly aircraft or even helicopters into the area. I mean, the thing about fighter jocks is that in every single war, they manage to kill 300% of the entire enemy air force because they never really supply accurate data with respect to how many planes they shoot down. So we're probably gonna have to wait until the end of the war to find out if the Ukrainian Air Force is having anything in terms of air-to-air effectiveness. But to my understanding, you're looking mostly at air-to-ground stuff, which all of these planes are capable of doing to greater or lesser effect, which are basically against Russian armored vehicles and Russian armored convoys. And they've certainly lost some aircraft in this role. So they have the Su-25 Frogfoot NATO designation, which is basically the Russian equivalent of an A-10, and they've lost several of those in this conflict.
And let's talk about the drone side of this, because so for example, the Ukrainians are fielding the Bayraktar, which is a really cheap drone alternative that people were really skeptical of before, but to the point from analysts, because Russia doesn't have air superiority, this slow moving drone has actually been quite effective. So can you speak to how the drone side of this conflict has looked?
Yeah, so I mean, the Ukrainians and the Russians are using lots of drones, but the Ukrainians seem to be using them more effectively. One of the biggest things drones do, and this is any kind of really light drones, just provide reconnaissance, provide information and data for the fielded forces, right? So that they know what's behind the enemy lines, they know who's moving and so forth. And so that's the first thing that your drone is, the first and really the most important thing that your drone is going to get for you. Now the Bayraktar does that, and that's a hugely important part of its role, but it also carries 4 laser guided bombs. And so it can not only reconnoiter an enemy target, it can also attack that target. And what makes it so effective is that on the one hand, it's pretty cheap. So you're not overly worried about losing them. And the Turks are just, they just want to make the factory go brrrt and sell more of these things. And they're probably going to sell them all over Europe.
I hope people, real quick, I hope people get the meme reference you're making there. It probably won't translate over audio, but
BRRT. Yeah, anyway, so their advantage is that they fly just above the useful range of anti-aircraft artillery and the useful range of man-pads. They are really small, so their radar cross-section, they have composite material. So they're not quite stealthy, but they're just hard to see. If that makes any sense. And they're so small and they're so inexpensive that in some cases, to shoot one of these down with an S-400, your air-to-air missile might cost more than the airplane you're shooting down. And so it's not, and you're not guaranteed of a hit because they're so small that they may avoid, the missile may not lock on or something else may go wrong. And you're throwing away your shot by shooting at one of these things rather than a sort of a big manned fighter. And so they're not completely immune to enemy fire, but they can fly over the lines and then they can hit things with their bombs from relative impunity. And they've done that in Libya, they've done that in Ethiopia, they've done that in Nagorno-Karabakh, and they're doing it in Ukraine.
So for the last two questions before we get to battleships to wrap this, one, a lot of just common discourse has been real surprise at the decrepitude of the Russian army specifically. So the armed forces on the ground, the anecdote everyone talks about is like the rotting tires. An example of just something that just is inconceivable to a Western, Chinese, any modern military. This is kind of incredible. What is the assessment of the Russian Air Force's performance and its state, given what the wisdom was around before the conflict started?
So, I mean, one of the biggest questions we've had, again, is like, why hasn't the Russian Air Force been doing anything? And, you can answer that question halfway with, well, there are just operational realities here, which are really difficult for the Russians to deal with. But I think, and Justin Bronk at RUSI is a great guy to follow on this. Michael Kaufman at CNA is wonderful for all questions Russian. But part of the answer seems to be their readiness rates don't really seem to be that high. The weather is a problem, right? They don't have the kind of all-weather capability that the U.S. Air Force, again, spent decades honing, and the weather over Ukraine in March and February is bad. And so they don't have sort of all the sensor packages that allow them to attack. We know that their flyers, their pilots get fewer hours in the cockpit. But on the other hand, they've been bombing the bejesus out of Syria for a while now. And so you would have expected that they would gain some experience out of that. But again, that's experience in a completely permissive air environment where they don't have to worry about enemy fighters, and they don't have to worry about they don't have to worry about surface-to-air missile systems. So, they're being asked to do something that they're not really trained to do, and they don't necessarily even have the equipment to do. And so the question of the corruption and the readiness rates and that sort of stuff, we just don't know, right? And I don't think we're going to know until we have sort of a much clearer picture into how the Russian military machine functioned here.
So how should we consider everything we've just discussed in the context of a possible conflict with China, especially over Taiwan?
We don't know at all, right? There were all kinds of reasons to suspect that the Russians would be a lot better than this, right? The Russians have been at war. They've been at war. They were at war against Chechnya, sort of a long-term war. They went to war against Georgia in 2008. It was really brief, but they learned a lot of lessons. 2014, Ukraine, 2015, Syria. So you expected that a military which has been doing things is one that gets better. The thing we don't know about the Chinese is it's a complete tabula rasa. Because we don't know how any of their military structures are going to function under fire. We can watch Chinese exercises, and their exercises look increasingly impressive. They look increasingly Western in nature, dissimilar combat training for pilots and a bunch of other stuff. But in an actual real world scenario, we know from the American experience that every time we actually go to war, it demonstrates a ton of problems we had no idea that we had. Mm-hmm. The Chinese have not been at war since 1979. And so there is a ton of stuff that is going to come up that they haven't anticipated. And to be honest, full-scale, high-intensity combat over Taiwan is not the theater that I would want to figure out what's wrong with my Army and my Navy and my Air Force. And that's a problem that China has to deal with.
Yeah. So for this last section, I'd love for you just to talk about battleships. It's the interesting context, aside from just the fact that they're cool, speaking to 7-year-old Rob, is the fact that I think there's an easy metaphor in comparing outmoded styles of warfare or outmoded structures. Obviously, the battleship is seen as very important during the 20s and 30s. Obviously, the aircraft carrier, which was not prioritized in the 20s, is actually much more important. So just go as long as you want. I will not interject. Just give us, why should we care about battleships? Why are they cool? Basically, everything like that.
Right. The story of battleships in terms of technology is one that's really interesting, right? Because we have this, I think, very pat story about, lots of people built them around World War I. They didn't really do anything. And then World War II came along and demonstrated they were obsolete compared to aircraft carriers and submarines, and that was that. And that, that does violence to the reality, right? The technological innovation that went into battleships between, say, 1905
actually, Rob, I have to apologize. I should have actually said What actually is a battleship? We just kind of like, what actually is a battleship? That's the setting stage question.
So a battleship is a line of battleship, right? Which is sort of takes from the Napoleonic era of you have a line of battle. And so ships are in a line and you are a line of battleship. Over time, you just shorten that to battleship. And a battleship is basically from, the 1890s on, it's supposed to be a great big steel ship that is the biggest ship in a particular battle, that has heavy guns, and that is intended first to destroy the enemy's battleships, and then to chase away or destroy all the smaller ships. One of the most famous battleships is called Dreadnought. Dreadnought was built in 1906, and basically made every other battleship in the world obsolete, essentially the day that she was launched, because she had her guns in a different configuration that was sort of much more well thought out, and she was a vastly superior vessel. And so it's weird because you got this massive transformation in 1906 of the technology of battleships, but by the time, say, 1918 rolls around, Dreadnought is a completely obsolete ship. Right, she's basically taken out of service because battleship technology has changed so much in just the 12 years since Dreadnought was built that she's now too dangerous to take into combat. And you think about that in context of, say, the USS Nimitz, which has been in service since 1977. It's just a different way of thinking about technology.
An aircraft carrier in this case.
Right. USS Nimitz, the aircraft carrier. Right. Well, and even, if we still had the USS Forrestal, which was built in the 1950s, it would be superior to any other aircraft carrier in the world. That's not a US aircraft carrier.
Really?
Right? So that technology has just not changed very much since the 1950s, right? It's changed in incremental ways. Battleships are important enough in the interwar period that countries view them as basically the nuclear weapons of the international system. And they create this gigantic treaty system, which is supposed to limit the number of battleships that are built and maintained. And so, Japan and the United States and Great Britain, basically are named the world's most powerful countries because they're allowed to have the most battleships, but the Japanese can't have quite as much, which causes all kinds of resentment. And so you have lots of construction and reconstruction. And finally, the last generation of battleships begins to come out right at the beginning of World War II. And these are ships that are both fast and they're powerful and they're well armored. But what we discover across the course of World War II is that while battleships are still really useful, and on this I'll brook no argument, that all of the navies that used battleships found them incredibly useful vehicles. So they didn't think the battleships were obsolete. What they did think was that their battleships were no longer efficient, right, in the sense of delivering combat power. So a battleship could take so much more punishment than an aircraft carrier, but an aircraft carrier can deal that punishment out from a much larger distance. And so it simply became inefficient to build new battleships based on the combat power that they could provide. And of course, we brought a few of them back into service in the 1980s, and they turned in good service in the Gulf War and off Lebanon and so forth. But there's only so much that you want to invest in this really large and really ancient platform that you have to train. You have to train people for these ships on equipment that is on absolutely no other ship in the U.S. Navy, and that's just in the end becomes a waste of time and a waste of money.
So all of the battleships, despite coming back in the 80s, early 90s, they are now. Does any nation field battleships still?
The closest thing we have to a battleship is I'm not going to try the Russian because I'd butcher it, but is the Russian battle cruiser, Peter the Great. Battle cruiser is a term that comes from the early part of the 20th century, but come the 1980s, when the Russians built these giant 27,000-ton cruisers, people looked at them and said, well, heck, that right there is a battle cruiser. And the name just stuck and everybody likes it. And so
it's a good name.
It's a good name. No, I love battlecruiser. And so it's the biggest ship in the Russian Navy, apart from their aircraft carrier that doesn't really go anywhere, and has an impressive array of weapons, and it's an impressive ship for showing the flag. And right now it's out basically sitting off the Norwegian coast, to my understanding, watching the NATO's cold response exercise. The Russians have another one of those that has been in refit essentially since like 1998, where the admiral of the Russian Navy once said, "I don't know if it's going to explode. It might. Who's to say, right?" And that may find its way back into service, although with Russia's new fiscal realities, I think it's an open question as to what the Navy is going to look like at all over the next decade. But yeah, Peter the Great and I believe it's Admiral Nakhimov are the largest surface warships, and we grace them with the name battle cruiser, even though it's a little bit ahistorical.
So then, in terms of the U.S. fleet right now, we've discussed aircraft carriers. We have then destroyers. Are cruisers a thing?
Yeah, although in modern times, cruisers and destroyers are basically the same size. So the difference between an American cruiser and a destroyer is like 1,000 tons.
Okay.
The Ticonderoga cruisers are slightly larger than the Arleigh Burke destroyers. And they do a little bit different. They're more on the air warfare side, where the destroyers are more multi-purpose. But for all intents and purposes, like in the modern U.S. Navy, cruisers and destroyers are interchangeable.
So
Navy
then,
people will be hostile when I say that, but that's my
and you were hinting at this. I want to make it explicit. Your take around the use of battleships in World War II is a little contrarian. So you're not saying that they were useless. How do we then? Because once again, as a non-expert, I just hear the word battleship used in the context of an aircraft carrier today, which is because the Chinese have missiles that could go 1,000, the carrier killer missiles that can go 1,000 miles. The age of the aircraft carrier is over in the same way that the age of the battleship was over. So how should we think about the metaphors that people are using, especially given like these debates moving forward?
Yeah, you got to be really super careful about them. I mean, the American understanding of the battleship is colored by the Pacific, where there were only a few battleship to battleship engagements, and where a lot of the Japanese battleships ended up being sunk by aircraft. If we looked at the European theater, the lessons of battleships are entirely different, right? The Italians, the British, the French, and the Germans all used battleships prolifically in all kinds of different contexts. And so you would never look at the European theater and say, well, the battleship is obsolete, because they fought in all of these different ways over the course of the war. And even in the Pacific, one of the ways that the aircraft carriers were protected was because the battleships were outstanding anti-air platforms. And really, until sinking them in port is a different thing than sinking them at sea. But there's a pretty good argument that until late 1944, when the U.S. is able to bring so much carrier air power, that Japanese battleships were basically invulnerable to air attack, simply because we couldn't put enough aircraft in the air to cause fatal damage, right? You can sink an aircraft carrier with one bomb. You cannot do that to a battleship. And so in the latter part of the war, we are able to sink the giant Japanese battleships with aircraft, but it takes hundreds of aircraft, right? Hundreds of aircraft in multiple sorties to do that. And that's a lot of combat power. And it doesn't suggest that what you're trying to kill is obsolete.
So let's wrap with this question. A lot of these topics are brand new to most listeners, so I'd love for you just to shout out. Some of your books are a little technical, but shout out any of your work that would be relevant, and just general interest books for people who want to learn more about air power and aviation in general.
Oh my goodness. Oh, there's so much stuff. So in terms of aviation, a good friend of mine is named Brian Lasley. He's wrote a number of books. He's wrote about Red Flag. He's wrote about the air war in Vietnam. For understanding the evolution of air power, is a really important guy. There's a blog called From Balloons to Drones that is outstanding for the history of air power. You can follow Aviation Weekly. There's a guy named Stephen Trimble, who's a fantastic journalist, talks a lot about taught me a lot about modern air power. In terms of my own work, I have the Grounded book, which is about the Air Force and the potential for abolishing the Air Force. And I like to think of it now not so much as abolishing the Air Force, but as being a call for defense reform, right? Reforming how we do military organizations. And I still believe we need to reform our military organizations. I have a book called The Battleship Book, which is literally exactly what it sounds like. My last book was From Patents to Power, which is a little technical because it has to do with intellectual property law, but there's so many interesting stories to tell about the conjunction between military technology and intellectual property law. It's just there's an absolutely fabulous set of vignettes about how IP and military technology interact.
You set yourself up, so I'll just throw this to you. Do you have like a 2-minute version of how you would reform the defense sector?
Yeah, I mean, so if I could step in and change everything, this is what I would do, right? I would do away with the idea that we need to base services around domains. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a retrospective justification for the Air Force. But with Space Force and proposals for Cyber Force, we're pursuing this to levels of madness, right? Every time you think of a new domain, you got to think of a new independent force to fight in that domain. Modern warfare is all about integration, right? It's all about multi-domain. In the future, what you want is not a bunch of different organizations that are hived out by domain, but rather you want organizations that are going to facilitate fighting and shaping the environment across a number of domains. And so in my perfect world, we would rethink probably around 2 big military organizations, one of which would resemble a combination of the Army and the Air Force, one of which would resemble a combination of the Navy and the Air Force and the Marine Corps. The Army's job would be fighting and winning wars. The Navy's job would be shaping the strategic environment. And you would think about their capabilities from, that perspective rather than we control this domain.
Oh, good luck. As you well know, right? You've by proposing, once again, as you said, this is if you're in charge of everything, because the structure you just described hits 80 trillion different interest groups at the same time. I'm actually struggling to think of a project that would, in more ways than one, hit different aspects at the same time.
We would have to lose a war in a catastrophic fashion for this to happen.
Oh, so this is okay. So this is another follow-up question, because I was going to ask, have there been times where things have been reorganized? But your point would be, it's only after something happens that this tile reform occurs.
Yeah, it feels that way. Yeah.
So I hope that we don't actually have to get to that point then. Let's stick with peace, but unoptimal versus optimized post Taiwan crisis defeat. So I think that's a great way to end. Rob, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
It's been a delight to be.